For 3 years, I'd bought into the fantasy. Beautiful wife, comfortable house, a picture-perfect marriage splashed across Facebook for everyone to envy. It was a lie, of course, a carefully curated facade that was starting to crack. The first hairline fractures had begun with Tanya's late nights. Work, she'd say, each time a little less convincingly. The hours she spent at the office stretched later and later, but the paychecks never reflected the extra effort. I'd stand by the window, watching for her headlights, the silence in the house growing heavier with each passing minute. When she finally slipped through the door, the scent of her perfume would be mixed with something else, something alien, something that wasn't me. "Just finishing up some reports," she'd offer, her voice a rehearsed monotone, her gaze always sliding away from mine. It was a performance, and I was a captive audience, watching her play a role I didn't recognize. She'd move through the house like a stranger, her footsteps too quiet, her presence too distant. The air, thick with unspoken questions, would carry the faint, lingering scent of Colonia's sharp citrusy note that clashed with the floral sweetness of her usual perfume. It wasn't my scent. I started to pay attention. I became a detective in my own life, searching for clues in the mundane. The way she'd cradle her phone, always face down, as if hiding some dark secret. The hushed phone calls she'd take outside, pacing in the backyard, claiming that the reception was better near the rose bushes. The slight, secretive smile that would play on her lips when certain messages popped up, a flash of something private and unknown. It was as if she lived in two worlds, and I was only allowed access to one. I started to feel like a ghost in my own home, a silent observer of a life I thought I knew. I'd find myself staring at her, analyzing every gesture, every glance, trying to decipher the codes of her hidden world. I knew I was becoming paranoid, obsessive, but I couldn't stop myself. The more I looked, the more I saw, and the more I saw, the more I questioned. My doubts grew like weeds, choking the last vestiges of trust. One night, while Tanya was showering, her phone lay on the kitchen counter, abandoned, vulnerable. It was a black, sleek rectangle, a silent witness to her duplicity. I had stared at that phone for weeks, willing it to reveal its secrets. My birthday, the password she'd always used, felt like a cruel joke now, a reminder of the intimacy she'd faked. My hands were shaking as I touched it, as I slid the screen open. It was like entering a forbidden room, each tap of my finger a step deeper into the darkness. The messages appeared on the screen, line after line of digital betrayal. There it was, a whole trove of intimate exchanges with Bart, her boss, the man I'd seen her laughing with at the company picnic, the man she'd called a great mentor. My stomach lurched, a sickening twist of nausea and disbelief. My breath hitched as I began to scroll, my eyes racing across the screen. "Miss you already," he'd texted just hours ago. The casual intimacy like a punch to my gut. "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," she'd replied, the words devoid of any care. "Last night was incredible." The phrase echoed in my head, each word a hammer blow to what remained of my illusions. The messages stretched back months, secret meetings disguised as business lunches, inside jokes that were never shared with me, detailed plans for rendezvous that were meticulously planned and executed. Each word felt like a knife blade twisting in my insides, shredding the fabric of our marriage into thin, unrecognizable ribbons. My vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin around me. The world shifted on its axis, and I was left reeling, struggling to maintain my balance. The sound of the shower stopping cut through my daze, sending a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. Her footsteps approached, the patter of bare feet on the tile floor sending shivers down my spine. I imagined her, wrapped in her towel, fresh from the shower, the scent of her soap filling the air. a vision of innocence, a lie I'd embraced for far too long. "Jeff," she called out, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. "What are you doing with my phone?" There was a note of caution in her tone, a flicker of concern in her voice. I held up the phone, the screen illuminating the lines of their betrayal. My voice was low, barely a controlled whisper. "Who's Bart?" Her face paled, the color draining away as if a switch had been flipped. It's not what you think." The words felt rehearsed, a line she'd used before. "Really?" I took a step toward her, the phone shaking in my hand, my knuckles white with tension. "Because I think you're fucking your boss." The words were out before I could stop them, raw and brutal and dripping with venom. She retreated, her back pressed against the wall, clutching her towel tightly around her body, as if it was a shield. "Jeff, please, let me explain." There was a flicker of panic in her eyes, a flash of the fear to come. I followed her into the bathroom, slamming the door behind me with a force that made the mirror rattle. "Explain what? How long you've been lying to me? How many times you've betrayed me?" The air crackled with the tension, heavy with unspoken accusations. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a strange mix of anger and exhilaration, the realization that everything I'd believed in was an illusion. "It's not serious," she pleaded, her voice small and weak, her body pressing against the cold, hard surface of the tile. "I was lonely, and he paid attention to me." Her words were a pathetic attempt at justification, a feeble excuse for her infidelity. "Not serious?" I laughed, the sound harsh, bitter, almost foreign to my own ears. "You've been sneaking around for months, and it's not serious?" The laughter bubbled up from deep within me, a dark, guttural sound that sent a shiver down her spine. I couldn't believe the arrogance of her words, the sheer audacity of her betrayal. In the confined space of the bathroom, the air thick with steam, I could see fear taking root in her eyes. My reflection in the mirror stared back at me, a stranger staring out from behind my own eyes. My face was flushed, jaw clenched so hard it ached, a vein pulsing like a trapped animal in my neck. This wasn't me, I thought, but if this wasn't me, then who was I? I grabbed her wrist, my fingers digging into her skin, forcing her to look at the screen, to face the evidence of her betrayal. "Read them." Read them out loud. My voice was a low growl, each word weighted with venom. Her voice trembled, a pathetic squeak, as she began to read their words. Each line fueled my anger. Each word chipped away at what remained of our marriage. 3 years of trust reduced to a handful of digital messages, a cruel testament to her infidelity. "Please," she whimpered, her face contorted in a mask of despair, tears streaming down her face. "I'll end it. I'll quit my job. We can fix this." The plea was a desperate attempt to regain control, to rewrite the narrative of our marriage. "Fix this?" My grip tightened, making her flinch. "Like you fixed things with him?" Her offer felt hollow, a pathetic attempt to erase the damage she had inflicted. The bathroom felt smaller, more claustrophobic, as the tension reached a breaking point. The steam from the shower still fogged the mirror, distorting our reflections. Her wet hair clung to her face, making her look smaller, more vulnerable. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in black streaks, a visual representation of her emotional breakdown. "You must have laughed at me," I snarled, my voice a dangerous whisper. Poor stupid Jeff, working late while his wife spreads her legs for her boss. My words were a cruel cutting barb, designed to wound her in the deepest way possible. "No, it wasn't like that." She tried to pull away, but I shoved her back against the wall, her body colliding with the cold, unforgiving tiles. "Jeff, you're hurting me," she cried out, her voice laced with fear and desperation. "Hurting you?" My voice dropped, becoming even more menacing. "You haven't even begun to understand what hurt feels like." The words hung in the air, a promise of the pain to come. In that moment, As I looked at her, trembling and broken, something inside me snapped. The loving husband I'd been was gone, replaced by something darker, more vengeful. Each late night, every lie, every secret message, they all demanded retribution. I wasn't just hurt, I was angry, and that anger was beginning to consume me. I trusted you, I spat, releasing her wrist. The sudden absence of pressure, almost as shocking as the grip had been. I gave you everything. My voice cracked with emotion, raw and exposed. She slid down the wall, her body collapsing into a huddled mass, hugging her knees to her chest, her face buried in her hands. I'm sorry, she sobbed, her voice barely audible through the tears. I'm so sorry. But her apologies were hollow, meaningless to me. They were just words, offering no solace or absolution. In the steamy confines of our bathroom, watching my wife crumble before me, I made a silent vow, a pact with the darkness that was growing inside me. She would pay for this betrayal, both of them would, and I would make sure their punishment lasted far longer than their pathetic little affair ever did. I turned and walked out, leaving her crying on the cold tile floor, her sobs echoing in the suddenly silent room. In the kitchen, her phone still displayed their messages, a digital testament to her infidelity. With methodical precision, I began taking screenshots, carefully saving evidence of their betrayal. This wasn't just about catching her, it was about building a case, a meticulously crafted plan for the destruction to come. This was just the beginning. They had no idea what was coming. The click of the lock echoed in the hallway, a soft, final sound that sealed Tanya's fate. I stood outside the bathroom door, savoring the muffled sobs that still drifted through the wood. 3 hours she'd been in there, trapped with her guilt and the echoes of my accusations. Each whimper was a victory, a confirmation of the power I now wielded. It was a twisted form of satisfaction, the sound of her pain feeding something dark and hungry inside of me. Please, Jeff, she called out, her voice weak and trembling. Let me out. We need to talk about this. Her plea was pathetic, a desperate attempt to regain some control in a situation she had irrevocably broken. I leaned against the door, my voice cool and controlled, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside me. Talk? Like you talked to Bart about us? About our marriage? My words were a cruel reminder of her deceit, a twisted echo of her own betrayals. The bathroom had become her confessional, and I was a merciless priest, extracting every painful detail of her sins. The details she offered, the way he'd touched her, the things they'd said, were like acid on my skin. Each admission was followed by a new wave of tears, a frantic attempt to justify her actions, to minimize the damage she had caused. But it was all futile. Nothing she could say could ever change what had happened, what she had done. The next morning, I watched her dress for work, her movements mechanical and uncertain. The dark circles under her eyes were a stark testament to her sleepless night, her face pale and drawn, as if drained of all life. She jumped when I spoke, her body reacting like a frightened animal. I've already called Bart, I said, watching her freeze at his name. The word was like a physical blow, causing her to flinch. Told him you're quitting. Effective immediately. I enjoyed the way her eyes widened in panic, her breath catching in her throat. But Jeff, we need my income, she started, her voice thin and wavering, as if she were speaking through a veil. What we need? I cut her off, my voice sharp and cold. Is for you to focus on fixing what you broke? Unless you'd rather I share those screenshots with everyone we know? The threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like a toxic cloud. I could see the fear in her eyes, the panic rising like a tidal wave. I had her, I had broken her, and it felt good. I had spent the night downloading their messages, creating a digital archive of her shame, a collection of her sins. I had saved everything, every word, every image, every timestamp, creating a weapon that I could use to destroy her reputation. Her parents, our friends, her professional contacts. I had their information ready, my fingers hovering over the send button. "You wouldn't," she whispered, her face pale as a ghost, but her eyes told me she knew I would. "Try me." I stepped closer, my presence a deliberate intimidation, watching her shrink away from me as if I was a monster. "One word from you, one wrong move, and everyone sees what kind of woman you really are." The words were like a cage, trapping her in a prison of my making. The transformation was already beginning. The confident, independent woman who had betrayed me was now crumbling before my very eyes, replaced by someone smaller, more fragile, and more afraid. Each flinch, each hesitation, was a victory, a sign of my growing control. I was reshaping her, molding her into the person I wanted her to be. The days blurred together as I meticulously crafted her new reality, a reality built on fear and control. I installed tracking software on her phone, a digital leash that would allow me to monitor her every move, every call, every message. Her social media accounts were now under my complete control. I changed the passwords, citing the need for transparency, a hollow excuse that served to solidify my power. It was my world now, and she was merely a puppet, dancing to my tune. Each night, I made her read her location history aloud, accounting for every minute spent away from home. The routine was a twisted form of intimacy, a way to ensure that she was always within my reach, always under my watchful eye. The digital world had become my weapon, a tool for my revenge. "The grocery store took 45 minutes today," I noted one evening, my eyes scanning the timeline. "That's 15 minutes longer than usual." My voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, but the underlying menace was palpable. There was a line," she stammered, her hands fidgeting with her dinner plate, her body tensing with anxiety. "Was there?" I pulled up the store's security camera footage on my phone, a little gift from a friend who worked there, a reminder of the power of my connections. "Because it looks pretty empty to me." The color drained from her face as I showed her the video, her eyes wide with panic. I just needed some time to think." Her explanations were becoming increasingly pathetic, feeble attempts to rationalize her actions. "Think about what?" My voice remained eerily calm, masking the fury that was simmering beneath the surface. "About running to Bart? About betraying me again?" The questions were a form of torture, twisting the knife deeper with every word. Her protests grew weaker with each passing day, her spirit slowly being crushed under the weight of my control. I fed our neighbors and friends carefully crafted stories about her infidelity, always presenting myself as the wronged husband, desperately trying to salvage our marriage. I played the victim to perfection, manipulating their sympathy, turning them against her. One by one, they began to turn away from her social circle shrinking to nothing. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations dried up, leaving her isolated and alone. "Sarah canceled our lunch again," she said one morning, staring at her phone with vacant eyes, the hope slowly fading from her face. "Can you blame her?" I asked, watching her shoulders slump, her body sagging with defeat. "Who wants to associate with someone like you?" The words were a calculated blow, designed to inflict maximum damage to her already fragile self-esteem. I'd jolt her awake in the middle of the night, the sudden awakening sending shivers down her spine, for another round of questions, my voice cutting through the silence like a razor blade. Each time, I'd drill her about the affair, looking for holes in her story, seeking inconsistencies that would justify the torture I was inflicting. Every variation, every slight change in her account meant another hour of interrogation, another piece of her spirit chipped away. I was like a surgeon, dissecting her, analyzing every aspect of her behavior. "Tell me about April 15th. I'd demand at 3 a.m., shaking her awake, the harshness of my voice, a deliberate violation. What did you do with him that day? The date was just one of many, a random marker in the calendar, but to her, it was another painful memory, a reminder of her infidelity. Her hands would tremble as she recounted the details, her voice barely a whisper, terrified of making a mistake. The dark circles under her eyes grew deeper, her sleep constantly interrupted by my inquisition, her body aching from the constant tension. The sleep deprivation had become a torture of its own, eroding her mind and body. I controlled every aspect of her life now. Her phone buzzed with my reminders throughout the day: when to eat, when to sleep, when to report her activities, turning her life into a carefully orchestrated prison, a clockwork mechanism built around my needs. Each notification made her jump, a Pavlovian response to my digital presence, a constant reminder of my unwavering control. I had reduced her to a shadow of her former self, a broken and defeated woman. The bathroom, where I'd first confronted her, became her sanctuary in a twisted way. Sometimes I'd find her sitting there, huddled on the floor, staring at nothing, silent tears rolling down her face. It was a place where she could retreat from the world, a silent reminder of the pain she had caused. I'd leave her there, knowing that the enclosed space represented both her prison and her only escape, a constant reminder of her confinement. You did this to yourself, I'd remind her daily, my voice flat and emotionless, devoid of any empathy. Everything that's happening is because of your choices. The words were like a curse, a reminder of her culpability. Watching her break was like watching a time-lapse of a flower wilting, slowly losing its color, its vitality, its beauty. The vibrant, confident woman who had betrayed me was gone, replaced by a ghost who moved through our house like a shadow, her eyes devoid of light, her body a mere shell of what it once had been. It was as if her soul was slowly leaving her body, leaving behind only an empty shell. This was justice, I told myself, my conscience twisting and turning in an attempt to justify my cruelty. This was what she deserved. Each day brought new ways to remind her of her sins, new methods to ensure she never forgot the price of betrayal, new means of extracting my pound of flesh. And in the depths of my twisted satisfaction, I knew that this was just the beginning, the first few steps on a long road to her complete and utter destruction. The woman I had married was disappearing, and in her place I was creating something else, something broken, something that would never dare to betray me again. Her imprisonment wasn't just physical, it was a carefully orchestrated destruction of everything she used to be, a meticulous dismantling of her former life. And I was just getting started. Revenge is a dish best served cold, and in the digital age, it's often served through a smartphone. Sitting in my home office, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face, I crafted the perfect social media post, just vague enough to avoid any legal repercussions, yet precise enough to destroy Bart's carefully constructed public image. This was the first domino in my meticulously planned campaign of destruction, a carefully placed blow to his career and reputation. I was meticulous, a master strategist of my own twisted game. Amazing how some executives think they can prey on their employees' marriages. I typed, my fingers flying across the keyboard, tagging the company, but deliberately avoiding mentioning Bart directly. Wonder what the board would think about a boss who sleeps with his married subordinates. The words were carefully chosen, laced with just the right amount of indignation and innuendo. I knew this was going to set off a firestorm, and I couldn't wait to watch it burn. The post spread like wildfire, each share, each angry comment, sending a surge of satisfaction through my veins. I felt a jolt of power with each notification, each new message that popped up on my screen. It was like watching a carefully constructed machine do its work, the gears turning, the pieces falling into place. I made Tanya watch as her lover's life began to unravel, forcing her to sit beside me as I monitored the growing scandal. The look of horror on her face was a twisted form of pleasure, a visual confirmation of my control over her. "Look," I whispered, scrolling through the responses, my voice laced with a mocking tone. "Your boyfriend's trending." The words were cruel, deliberately designed to inflict maximum pain. She sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, her body trembling with anxiety and fear. "Please stop this," she begged, her voice barely a whisper, her face contorted in a mask of despair. "You're destroying his career." "He destroyed my marriage," I replied coldly, my eyes fixed on the screen. "Now he gets to watch everything he built crumble." My words were like ice, devoid of any empathy or compassion. It was a simple, brutal equation. He hurt me, and now I was hurting him. It was as simple and elegant. The campaign escalated methodically, each move calculated and precise. Anonymous tips to industry blogs, carefully worded reviews on professional websites, strategically placed comments on online forums, all designed to chip away at Bart's carefully constructed public image. It was a digital assault, an avalanche of negativity designed to bury him under an avalanche of accusations. I was the puppet master, pulling the strings, orchestrating his demise. I created fake profiles, anonymous accounts to share tales of his predatory behavior, each story carefully crafted to be just plausible enough to seem real, just scandalous enough to spread quickly through the internet. I was a storyteller, a fabricator of lies, turning the digital landscape into my own personal weapon. Other women came forward with their own stories, some true, some inspired by my carefully crafted narrative. The snowball effect was beautiful to watch, the scandal gathering momentum with every new claim. "Your story inspired me to speak up," one woman wrote in a viral post, a comment that was carefully calculated to incite further outrage. I smiled, the corners of my mouth twitching in amusement, knowing I'd written it myself from one of my many sock puppet accounts. I was a ghost in the machine, manipulating the digital world to my own twisted end. Bart's first attempt at damage control was pathetic, a feeble attempt to regain control of the situation. A carefully worded statement about misunderstandings and false allegation, a hollow attempt to minimize the damage he had caused. I leaked screenshots of his messages with Tanya in response, strategically edited to make him appear even more predatory and manipulative, and then anonymously leaked them to several news outlets and blogs. The carefully crafted image of respectability began to crumble before my eye. The company's board called an emergency meeting, their faces grim as they entered the building. I watched through social media, a silent observer in my carefully orchestrated drama, as Bart arrived at the office, the cameras following his every move. His confident stride was gone, replaced by the hesitant steps of a man watching his life collapse, a visual testament to the power I had over him. The man who had once moved with purpose and confidence was now a shadow of his former self. "Congratulations," I told Tanya that evening, showing her the news, my voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Your boyfriend's been suspended pending investigation." My words were like a punch to the gut, a deliberate reminder of her role in his downfall. She sat in silence, her face pale, tears silently rolling down her cheeks, her body slumped in defeat. I could see the guilt eating at her, the knowledge that she had played a part in his downfall weighing heavily on her conscience. Each new headline was another weight on her soul, a reminder of the destruction she had helped set in motion. Her misery was my pleasure, her pain my satisfaction. The final blow came from an unexpected source, but I had subtly encouraged it, guiding it to fruition. Bart's wife, a woman I'd never met, but had subtly manipulated with information and hints about his affair. She received copies of every message, every intimate detail of his affair. I'd made sure she knew everything, carefully and systematically. She filed for divorce, publicly thanking me for exposing the truth, her words spreading like wildfire, a public act of humiliation that added to the inferno of Bart's ruined reputation. "Please," Tanya whispered one night, staring at her phone, her eyes wide with terror. "He's lost everything." Her voice was a pathetic plea, a desperate attempt to bring an end to the carnage. "Not yet," I replied, my eyes scanning his LinkedIn profile, watching as company after company withdrew job offers, his career prospects dwindling by the day. "But he will." The words were a promise, a grim declaration of intent. In just a few weeks, I had transformed Bart from a respected executive into a social pariah, a cautionary tale. His name became synonymous with workplace scandal, a label that would forever haunt him. Job applications went unanswered. His phone remained silent. His former colleagues crossed the street to avoid him, and he was essentially a ghost in the world he had once occupied. I had stripped him of his power, his status, and his dignity, leaving him with nothing. The satisfaction was intoxicating, a heady rush of power that made me feel like a god. Every destroyed opportunity, every closed door, every rejection was a form of justice, my twisted sense of retribution finally being satisfied. Tanya watched it all, a prisoner to the consequences of her choices, powerless to stop the destruction she had helped set in motion, trapped in a cage of my own creation. She was now a passive observer of her own destruction, and that of the man she betrayed me with. But even as I reveled in Bart's downfall, a darkness lurked beneath my elation, a whisper that told me this wasn't enough, the sense that this was incomplete. There was still more pain to inflict, more punishment to devise. After all, they had humiliated me in private. It was only fair that their suffering should be public, a grotesque theater of my own design. I wanted everyone to know what they had done, to witness their shame. "The pink pony," I sneered, the words dripping with contempt as I pulled into the strip club's parking lot. The neon sign flickered overhead, casting a sickly pink glow across the asphalt, a visual representation of the degradation that awaited us inside. "Perfect place for someone like you." The words were a deliberate jab, designed to wound her as deeply as possible. Tanya sat motionless in the passenger seat, her body slumped in defeat, her face a mask of utter despair. Gone were the designer clothes and the carefully applied makeup, replaced by something cheap and worn. I'd made sure she looked the part, a visual representation of her fallen status. She was a shell of her former self, reduced to a broken, defeated woman. The torn jeans, the cheap tank top, the smeared mascara from constant crying were all deliberate choices, designed to emphasize her degradation. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, I'll find another job." The fear in her voice was palpable, a desperate attempt to avoid the humiliation that was about to come. "You lost that privilege when you spread your legs for Bart." I killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying her fear. "Besides, you're already experienced at selling yourself, aren't you?" The words were a brutal reminder of her infidelity, a calculated jab that twisted the knife deeper. I could see her flinch, the impact of my words hitting her with the force of a physical blow. The club's neon sign cast a sickly pink glow across her pale face, a grotesque halo of shame. Inside, the throbbing bass leaked through the walls, a heartbeat of degradation, a relentless reminder of the place she was about to enter. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap perfume, and desperation, a toxic mix that permeated everything in the vicinity. I could see the fear in her eyes, the knowledge that her old life was about to come crashing down. I'd arranged this interview through an old client, A man who owed me a favor, a connection that allowed me to orchestrate this particular torture. I made sure he understood exactly what I wanted, the kind of humiliation I expected to be inflicted, and he eagerly agreed. It was a macabre collaboration, a twisted alliance in the service of my revenge. The manager, Tony, greeted us with a knowing smirk, his eyes crawling over Tanya like insects, assessing his newest commodity. His gaze was lecherous, his smile predatory, as if he already knew what her role was going to be. He was like a shark circling his prey, knowing he had won. The smell of stale beer and desperation clung to everything, a tangible representation of the club's dark soul. "So," he drawled, leaning back in his office chair, his gaze fixed on Tanya. "Any dancing experience?" His tone was suggestive, his words laced with a crude innuendo that made Tanya flinch. Tanya's voice trembled, barely a whisper, her body shaking with fear. "No, She couldn't bring herself to complete the sentence, the shame overwhelming her. "She's a quick learner," I interrupted, my hand squeezing her shoulder a little too tightly, enjoying the way she flinched under my touch. "Aren't you, honey?" My voice was laced with a cold mockery, a deliberate attempt to humiliate her further. The interview was just a formality. Tony had already agreed to make her life hell, to punish her as I had wanted. Extra shifts, the worst time slots, the minimum tips, everything designed to break her spirit further, to grind her down until she was nothing. It wasn't just about employment. It was about destruction. I was using him as a tool, another weapon in my arsenal of revenge. "Strip," Tony commanded, gesturing to the tiny office stage, a platform of shame where she would expose herself to the leering gaze of strangers. "Let's see what we're working with." The words were a brutal command, a deliberate degradation of her personhood. Tears streamed down Tanya's cheeks, leaving black streaks on her already smeared makeup as she climbed onto the platform. Her movements slow and hesitant. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she reached for her tank top, the fabric suddenly feeling like a heavy shroud. I watched, a cold smile playing on my lips, as my once proud wife began her descent into this abyss, her humiliation a twisted source of pleasure. This was the woman who thought she could betray me without any consequences. The next few weeks blurred into a nightmare of long nights and degrading performances. Each day, a new step down into her personal hell. I made sure to be there for every shift, a silent observer in the darkest corner, my eyes never leaving her, monitoring her every move. I was the watchful eye, the ever-present reminder of her sin. The other dancers called her Ghost, fitting for someone who seemed to have lost her soul, a hollow shell devoid of life. "Look at me," I'd command when she danced past my table, the words a cruel reminder of her purpose there. "Remember why you're here." My gaze was intense, a deliberate attempt to humiliate her further, to strip her of any remaining dignity. She'd meet my gaze, her eyes empty, mechanical movements matching the pulsing music, her body moving without any passion or emotion. She had become a machine, devoid of any feeling or personality. The confident woman who'd once commanded boardroom attention now crawled across sticky stages, her body on display for crumpled dollar bills, reduced to a pathetic caricature of her former self. The contrast was sickening, a visual representation of her fall from grace. Some nights I'd invite former colleagues to the club, a deliberate attempt to inflict maximum damage, watching their shock turn to cruel amusement as they recognized her. "Isn't that Tanya?" they'd whisper, their eyes widening in disbelief. Bart's mistress? Each recognition was another nail in the coffin of her former life, another step towards her complete and utter destruction. I was systematically erasing her old life, replacing it with a new one built on shame and humiliation. The transformation was complete. She danced mechanically to the beat, her vacant stare fixed on some distant point, as if watching her old life fade away, her movements devoid of any passion or joy. The other dancers avoided her, sensing something broken, something dangerous in her vacant stares, as if she carried a contagious disease of despair. They knew she was different, marked by the shame of her betrayal, and they were wary of her. "Please," she'd begged some nights, collapsed in exhaustion in the dimly lit dressing room, her voice barely a whisper. "I've learned my lesson." Her pleas were pitiful, devoid of any real emotion. But there was no lesson, not really, not in the way she imagined. Only punishment and my twisted need to watch her suffer, to ensure she felt the same helplessness, the same humiliation I'd felt discovering her betrayal. It was a perverse form of justice, a twisted expression of my own pain. The dance floor was her prison, the spotlight her instrument of torture. The club had become her prison, the stage her torture chamber, and I was the sadistic warden, ensuring she remained trapped within its walls. Each dance, each degrading moment, fed my twisted desire for revenge, and I was never satisfied. I watched her spirit die a little more each night, a hollow shell drifting through the motions of her life, finding a perverse satisfaction in her descent, feeling a surge of power with each new act of degradation. Tony played his part perfectly, a willing accomplice in my dark plan, scheduling her for the worst shifts, making her dance when the crowd was at its most aggressive, making sure she felt the full weight of her humiliation. He understood what I wanted, not just employment, but destruction, the systematic dismantling of her self-esteem. "She's breaking," he told me one night, counting out her meager tips, his voice a low murmur, his eyes fixed on her as she moved across the stage. Never seen anyone fade away like this. He was an observer too, a witness to her unraveling, a silent participant in her destruction. I nodded, watching her mechanical movements on stage, my face devoid of any emotion. "Good." My voice was flat, a cold expression of the satisfaction I felt, a cruel confirmation of her fate. The woman I'd married was gone, replaced by this hollow shell, this ghost who danced for strangers while I watched from the shadows, her movements vacant, her eyes devoid of light. Her punishment had become my obsession, her suffering my only source of satisfaction, a twisted reflection of my own inner darkness. But even this wasn't enough. The darkness inside me grew hungrier with each passing night, demanding more, always more, like a never-ending thirst that could never be quenched. I didn't realize then that my revenge was consuming us both, turning us into something neither of us would recognize, trapping us both in a cycle of pain and retribution. Rain lashed against my windshield, blurring the street lights into streaks of color as I drove home from the Pink Pony, the windshield wipers working overtime to clear the deluge. Another night of watching Tanya's spirit die a little more. Another small victory in my campaign of revenge. The satisfaction had become routine, almost boring, a hollow feeling that barely registered anymore. I barely noticed the headlights behind me, growing larger in my rearview mirror, the approach seemingly innocuous. The rain was heavy, the night dark, and I was lost in my own thoughts, numb to the world around me. The impact came without warning, a violent collision that sent my car spinning out of control, a disorienting dance of metal and glass. Metal screamed against metal, the sound piercing through the drumming rain as my car veered across the lanes, the tires losing their grip on the slick asphalt. The world tilted, the familiar landmarks turning into a disorienting blur, and glass shattered around me like deadly confetti, the fragments spraying the inside of the car like a hail of icy daggers. Pain exploded through my body, a searing agony that shot through my limbs as the guardrail crumpled under the force of the collision, a violent stop to my momentum. When the world finally stopped spinning, I was trapped in a cocoon of twisted metal, the car a mangled wreck, my body pinned within the wreckage. Through the spider-webbed windshield, I saw another car, badly damaged but still running, its headlights cutting through the rain like accusing eyes. The driver's door opened, and a familiar figure emerged, his silhouette dark and menacing against the backdrop of the storm. Bart stood in the rain, his figure outlined against the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles in the distance, watching me struggle in the wreckage. A grim smile on his face. Blood trickled down my face, mingling with the rain, but I could see his expression clearly. A mirror of the cold satisfaction I'd worn while systematically destroying his life, a perfect reflection of the monster I had become. "How does it feel?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the relentless drumming of the rain, each word laced with a sinister satisfaction. To be helpless? To watch everything spin out of control? The words were a deliberate taunt, a twisted echo of my own cruelty, a reminder of the helplessness I had inflicted on so many. I tried to move, but a searing pain shot through my legs, a throbbing agony that made me gasp for breath. Something was definitely broken, the bones twisting in ways they were never meant to twist. "You're insane," I gasped, tasting blood in my mouth, my voice a weak and pathetic whisper. He laughed, a hollow, broken sound that echoed in the rain, devoid of any joy or mirth. "Insane? You destroyed my career, my marriage, my entire life, everything I worked so hard to build. And for what? Because your wife chose me?" The words were a desperate plea for understanding, an attempt to justify his actions, a feeble attempt to find meaning in the chaos I had unleashed. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face, and the polished executive was gone, replaced by something feral, something dangerous, something completely untethered from the constraints of society. He'd lost weight, his expensive suit replaced by worn, ill-fitting clothes, his face gaunt and his eyes burning with a barely contained rage. The man I'd systematically destroyed had been reborn as something darker, a vengeful creature seeking retribution. I had made him into a mirror image of myself. "They'll arrest you for this," I threatened, my voice weak and trembling, a futile attempt to regain some sense of control over the situation. I knew the threat was empty, meaningless in the face of what he had done. "Maybe," he shrugged, the rainwater running down his face like tears, masking his emotions. "But they'll find a man with nothing left to lose. You made sure of that." The words were a chilling reminder of the consequences of my actions, a declaration that I had pushed him too far, turning him into a monster as terrible as I was. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment, announcing the arrival of the emergency services. Bart took one last look at me, trapped and bleeding in my mangled car, his expression a mixture of triumph and despair. "Revenge isn't as satisfying as you thought, is it?" His words hung in the air, a haunting echo of the emptiness I had felt, as he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving me to face the consequences of my actions alone. I drifted in and out of consciousness in the hospital, my body a broken, mangled mess, the pain a constant, searing agony. The doctors spoke of multiple fractures, internal bleeding, months of rehabilitation, and a long, arduous recovery, a future filled with pain and uncertainty. Pain became my constant companion, each breath a reminder of Bart's revenge, a physical manifestation of the damage I had caused. When Tanya first visited, I barely recognized her, the face before me a pale imitation of the woman I had once married. She sat beside my bed, perfectly still, watching the machines that kept track of my vital signs, her eyes vacant, devoid of any emotion or warmth. Her stripper's makeup was gone, replaced by something else, an emptiness that seemed to radiate from within, a void that consumed everything in its path. "Are you happy now?" I managed to ask through cracked lips, the words slurred and weak, my voice a mere whisper. The question was a desperate attempt to grasp at something, to understand the situation I had created. She tilted her head, studying me with detached curiosity, her gaze cold and distant, as if she were examining a specimen in a lab. Happy? Her voice was flat, emotionless, a monotone that sent a shiver down my spine. I don't feel anything anymore. Her words were like a death sentence, a confirmation of the devastation I had wrought, the death of her spirit. The words chilled me more than the pain ever could. The realization that the woman I'd systematically broken had transformed into something eerily calm, unnaturally still, something that was completely devoid of humanity, sent shivers down my spine. The doctors say you'll need help, she continued, her fingers tracing patterns on the hospital blanket, her movements precise and deliberate. Someone to take care of you during recovery. The words were delivered without any emotion, a cold, clinical assessment of my situation. You'll help me, I said, but it came out more like a question, a desperate plea for help that was couched in a demand. I was no longer in control, no longer the puppet master of this twisted drama. Her smile was wrong somehow, a grotesque imitation of the warmth it once held, like a mask that didn't quite fit, a visual representation of her emptiness. Of course, that's what wives are for, right? Her words were a hollow echo of the vows we had exchanged, a cruel reminder of the life we once shared. She began coming every day, a mechanical routine, performing her duties with robotic precision, her eyes fixed on some distant point, her movements stiff and awkward, adjusting pillows, helping with medication, watching me struggle through physical therapy, her touch cold and lifeless, devoid of any warmth. But her eyes never changed, two empty pools reflecting nothing, a void that seemed to consume everything in its path. Sometimes, when the pain was worst, and my grip on reality started to waver, I'd catch her watching me with that strange half-smile, a chilling expression that sent shivers down my spine. In those moments, I'd remember how I'd watched her on stage, taking pleasure in her humiliation, and I knew, with chilling certainty, that our roles had been reversed. Now, she had become the audience to my suffering, watching my decline with the same detached interest I had once shown. "Does it hurt?" she'd ask, pressing just a little too hard while changing bandages, her voice devoid of any compassion, a cruel curiosity that made my skin crawl. Her questions were not born of concern, but rather a morbid fascination with my pain. The doctors spoke of healing, of eventually returning to normal, a future that was filled with hope. But watching Tanya's hollow eyes, feeling her cold hands on my broken body, I understood there would be no return to normal. We were both too far gone, transformed by the darkness we'd embraced, and trapped in a cycle of pain that would likely never end. The damage was irreversible, the scars deep and lasting. My revenge had come full circle, creating something far more terrifying than I'd intended, a twisted mockery of justice. In breaking Tanya, I'd given birth to something empty, something devoid of emotion, something capable of watching suffering with the same detached interest I'd once shown, a reflection of my own monstrous nature. The monster I had created was now my keeper, and the thought sent shivers down my spine. As I lay in my hospital bed, trapped and dependent on the very woman I'd tortured, I realized the true cost of revenge, the utter devastation it had wrought. It hadn't just destroyed Tanya, it had destroyed us both, leaving behind shells of who we used to be, empty husks that were haunted by the ghosts of our past. The victory had turned into a defeat, the triumph into a tragedy, and in the quiet moments, when pain and morphine blurred the lines of reality, I'd see that strange smile playing on her lips, and wonder what forms of revenge an empty person might devise, what horrors she was capable of now that she had nothing left to lose. The cycle, I realized, might never end, and the darkness we had embraced together would likely consume us both, forever trapped in this cycle of pain and retribution.